A woman after getting married found out her fancy husband just simply wanted her to be a stepmom for his son. This made her, a person who was always proud of herself, completely lose it. To get revenge on her husband, she secretly took her stepson to a remote cottage and took advantage of the quiet night to kill the boy in the room. She thought her plan was perfect, so she checked out and left. But the next day when she checked out, the cottage owner, Jian, saw blood on her record while cleaning. Realizing something was wrong, he quickly checked the room really carefully. When he opened the bathroom door, he smelled strong bleach. Jian's heart felt heavy. Then, he got in his neighbor's car, looked at their dash cam, and was scared to see that when the woman left, she was only carrying a big suitcase, and her son wasn't with her. Knowing the truth, Jian was about to call the cops, but he stopped. He knew that if the murder at his cottage was found out, his business would be hard to run in the future. Plus, the cottage was the place his wife loved the most. He had promised his wife that he would keep the business going. In the end, Jian chose to keep it quiet. To help the woman get rid of the proof of murder, he cleaned the whole room. Then he took the laundry to the cleaners and said it was a rush because his daughter was coming back. When the guy at the cleaners was putting the laundry away, he noticed 2 towels were missing because he always brought 10 towels at a time. Jian quickly went home and looked everywhere, finally finding one on the balcony. He remembered that this was the one he had wrapped around the boy after he got wet in the rain. Jian thought everything was over, but the woman showed up again a year later. This time, she was driving a new red car. Jian got a bad feeling in his stomach right away. She asked to rent a room for the night, but she hadn't booked it ahead of time. Since his daughter was bringing her boyfriend home to meet him that day, Jian didn't want anything bad to happen, so he was going to reject the woman. But as soon as his daughter got out of the car, she told him she couldn't stay because she had to go back to Seoul for something important. So she kindly let the woman stay. Jian had no choice but to accept. That evening, while entertaining his future in-laws, Jian was constantly on the edge. Unexpectedly, the woman walked over to the table and gave them a bottle of wine to thank them for letting her stay. Seeing her try to act friendly, Jian felt like he was sitting on a hot stove. He was about to get up to get a glass of wine, but the woman followed him, saying she wanted to use the record player in the living room. Jian flatly refused, saying it was broken. After seeing his daughter and her boyfriend off, Jian went to sleep. Suddenly, he heard a noise. It was someone using a shovel to dig in the ground. Jian was scared and ran outside. Seeing his wife digging, he asked her what she was doing. Seeing her crying and continuing to pull out flowers from the planter, he quickly ran over to hug his wife and comfort her. But when he looked closely, he realized that it was the other woman. Jian woke up with a start. It was just a dream. But Jian was worried that the woman was up to something, so while she was out, he ran into the room to check everything. He didn't find anything unusual. At that moment, the woman came back carrying a bag. Jian thought it was a bag of tools for getting rid of a body, but it was just a new swimsuit she had bought. Jian asked her if she had been there last year with her son. She casually denied it, but he said that she had told him she was scared of water back then. The woman told him he mistook her for someone else, then jumped into the pool and started swimming. Jian could only walk away helplessly. However, he wasn't giving up and still wanted to talk to her directly. When he saw her enjoying her meal, he suddenly got angry and shoved her into the food plate. But the woman just laughed even harder. However, this scene was just his imagination. On the contrary, the woman asked him why he pretended not to know her. Jian didn't answer her question but asked her why she came back to this place. The woman said she hadn't planned on coming back, but suddenly remembered him and came here. However, he pretended not to know her, which meant he had been thinking about her all this time. Jian didn't dare to face her directly, but his heart was filled with regret for the boy. He thought that he had caused the boy to become a wandering spirit. Jian didn't want to continue being tortured by guilt, so he went to the police station to confess. As he pushed open the door and entered the police station, he suddenly got a nosebleed. He was about to use a tissue when he noticed a family photo tucked in his pocket. Seeing his daughter circled in red ink, he immediately realized it was done by the woman. Afraid that his daughter would be involved, Jian quickly left the police station. He was worried about his daughter and went to her workplace. He saw the woman across the street. He was so scared, he panicked and chased after her, but almost got hit by a car while crossing the street. After calming down, he realized that it was just a hallucination. But then, while having dinner with his friend, the woman appeared again. He saw her grab a fire extinguisher and knock his friend unconscious. However, it was just another one of his delusions. Seeing his friend safe and sound, he finally felt relieved. To stop being mentally tortured, Jian wanted to find out the woman's family information and address, but he discovered that she used his son's name when she booked the room, and her phone number was not reachable. At this point, the woman not only had the key to his cottage, but she also knew his daughter's face. All of this made Mr. Jian extremely terrified. What he couldn't believe was that the woman had made herself at home, even going to the flower shop to buy a lot of plants. She excitedly returned to the cottage, showing Mr. Jian her shopping haul, but he ignored her. At this point, he just wanted to find out more about her. Seeing her go to the pool, Mr. Jian secretly went into her room, hoping to find some information about her, but got nothing. Suddenly, he remembered that the woman always carried her computer around, so he found her laptop. Unexpectedly, he needed to enter a password to log in. He had to take the laptop to a guy who specializes in fixing computers, asking him to help him unlock it. The guy said that the only way to unlock it was to reformat the hard drive, which would also erase everything on it. Mr. Jian sighed in frustration. However, when he returned home, he found out that the woman had bought many green plants and was decorating his cottage like her own home. Thinking about how she might stay for a long time, Mr. Jian became even more afraid. Even worse, the next day, the woman started throwing away some of his belongings. Mr. Jian couldn't take it anymore, so he rushed into the pool, pushed her under the water, but couldn't bring himself to finish the job. To force her to leave, he confessed that he knew she had killed the boy. Unexpectedly, she didn't panic at all and said the only thing he had now was the dashcam footage, which wasn't enough evidence. Furthermore, even if it did happen, he didn't report it to the police and even cleaned up the blood, wiped down every corner of the house, replaced the missing towels, and pretended he had never met her before. If he reported it to the police now, she would be charged with murder, and he would be charged with covering up the crime for a whole year. The woman thought she had him figured out, but Mr. Jian had secretly recorded their conversation and her confession to murder. The next day, the woman woke up and saw Mr. Jian suddenly leaving. She happened to see the recorder in the living room. Sensing something was wrong, she immediately went outside. Just as Mr. Jian was about to reach the police station, she rammed her car into his. Mr. Jian woke up again in the hospital. Luckily, he only suffered minor injuries. But when he looked around, he found the woman searching for him. Frightened by her, he quickly pulled the curtains closed. After he returned to the cottage, the woman pretended nothing had happened. She calmly painted and said she was also sore all over, but her painting was smooth and flawless. He asked her if she had taken his bag, and she said she threw it away because the dashcam footage had been stressing him out. She told him to relax now. Mr. Jian demanded that she leave immediately and promised to keep her secret forever, but the woman refused to go. She even brazenly asked Mr. Jian sold her the cottage. She said it was more like her home than his. He just lived there before her. That wasn't enough reason for the cottage to be his forever. It was no longer a battle to find evidence to prove the truth. It had become a territorial war started by the woman. So Mr. Jian ran to the woods and built a tent, while constantly renting out the cottage to other people, forcing the woman to move out. But unexpectedly, she argued with the guests, forcing the police to intervene. Finally, the woman had to concede and move into a storage room temporarily. When she contacted Mr. Jian again, he asked her to move out because he had another guest coming to stay. But because she was there, he couldn't let anyone come in to clean. She threatened to kill his daughter, but he didn't bother to answer and just hung up the phone. This made the woman furious, and she wanted to smash her phone. However, as she was packing up and getting ready to leave, a policeman knocked on the door to ask some questions. The next day, Mr. Jian received a phone call from the new guest complaining that the woman wouldn't give them the key. He had no choice but to go home and handle this. Seeing that the woman refused to give the key, he took his own key, handed it to the guests, and took his stuff to go clean the room. However, Officer Sian Tai walked out from inside, informing him that he had rented the cottage. Sian Tai criticized Mr. Jian for treating the woman badly, even suspecting that he was harassing and bullying the woman because she was alone. Just like that, the woman walked into the cottage with Sian Tai's friends, and they had fun playing around. Before leaving, Sian Tai was worried about the woman being alone and promised to come back tomorrow. Mr. Jian was anxious and had to return home. The three of them sat down to eat dinner together. Sian Tai continued to defend the woman in front of Mr. Jian. When she went out to get some wine, Mr. Jian asked Sian Tai why he chose to be a policeman. The woman came back with a bottle of wine, but Mr. Jian refused to drink it and also reminded Sian Tai to be careful. That night, she went to Mr. Jian's room and took his toothbrush, complaining that Sian Tai wouldn't go home and wanted to stay overnight. She hated it, so she wanted Mr. Jian to tell him that they had made up and chase him away. However, Mr. Jian said that he was the renter, not her. Besides, having a police officer around would make him feel safer. She offered to split the cottage with him, but he just called her crazy. He would never live with a murderer. The woman couldn't hold back her emotions and asked him if he wanted to know how she dealt with the boy. Would he still be able to stay here after knowing that? Mr. Jian said nothing, pushed her down on the bed, touched her neck, and warned her that this was his house and she couldn't take it from him. Then he went outside, but Sian Tai saw him. He was afraid that Mr. Jian had done something to the woman, so he rushed into the room. Seeing her sitting absent-mindedly on the bed, Sian Tai wanted to go out and deal with Mr. Jian, but she held him back and gave him a kiss. Mr. Jian drove away, but then returned with a piece of wood in his hand and chased the two of them out of his house. Even though Sian Tai rented the place, being in his room was still trespassing. Sian Tai confronted Mr. Jian. but as he was about to grab him when the police siren sounded. It turned out that Mr. Jian had called the police earlier. He was about to tell the chief about what happened a year ago, but she got a phone call, interrupting him. When she came back, he just told the chief to tell Sion Tae that he didn't want him at his cottage anymore, and he would refund his deposit. However, even though his colleagues reminded him, Sion Tae still ignored them and went to the cottage to see the woman. When he entered the cottage and didn't see anyone, he wanted to leave. But before leaving, he accidentally saw a backpack and found a recorder inside. Sion Tae ran back to the station, but the woman's car was chasing him. She was sitting in the middle of a cornfield, calling Sion Tae, blaming him for going this far. Mr. Jian didn't answer but said he would sell her the cottage but asked her to wait a few days. He hung up the phone and went to the hospital to visit his friend, but he saw a news report on TV. A roadside motel, over 10 years ago, was completely abandoned because a murder had happened there. He was worried that his cottage would become like that, so he tried to contact the former owner of the roadside motel, Mr. Gu. As a result, he found out that Mr. Gu was not only mentally unstable, but his memory was stuck in the days when the murder happened at the motel. Just as Mr. Jian was about to leave, he was suddenly kidnapped by a teenager. It was Mr. Gu's son, Ji-Ho. It turned out that over 10 years ago, Mr. Gu, in order to attract customers, had introduced his motel to a man he met on the road, but he had no idea that the man was a serial killer. As a result, on the second day after the man checked in, a headless female corpse was found in his motel room. Although the murderer was eventually caught by the police, the motel business was affected by it. For half a year they had no income. Some guests even called and harassed them at night, saying bad things. Mr. and Mrs. Gu were desperate and could only close the motel and work for others. But wherever they went, they were gossiped about. Even their son couldn't escape being bullied by his classmates. The couple had no way out, so they had to sell the motel for their livelihood. But because the motel had been a crime scene, they were forced by the real estate agent to sell it at a very low price, and they couldn't find a suitable buyer. The Gu family fell into dire straits. As for Mrs. Gu, she suffered a series of shocks and couldn't escape the murder of that year. She was tortured to the point of exhaustion both physically and mentally, so she left a letter and ran away. Since then, the Yu family was shattered. And what made things even worse was that the murderer not only couldn't remember the crimes he had committed, but he also said that he was just parking on the side of the road that day, and it was Mr. Gu who invited him to stay at the motel. Mr. Gu was completely crushed by these words and became eccentric. His son, Ji-Ho, for revenge, endured until the murderer was released from prison. He knew that the law couldn't punish this kind of person, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. Ji-Ho didn't expect to fail. Luckily, there was an accomplice of Ji-Ho's in the hospital room. But to escape the police, the murderer punched the other guy, making him bleed profusely. The accomplice remembered Ji-Ho telling him that if he failed, he needed 3 minutes to get to the hospital. So the accomplice rushed to attack the murderer, buying Ji-Ho some time. In this desperate situation, Ji-Ho arrived at the hospital room in time and achieved his goal. To avoid being chased by the police, he jumped out of the window and quickly returned to his secret hideout. Mr. Jian saw him return, covered in blood, and wasn't shocked at all, because he had just seen the murder confession letter the killer had written over the years under the bed. Ji-Ho didn't hurt Mr. Jian, but said sadly that everything was over. Then he took the gun, chased Mr. Jian outside, and put a picture of him with his parents, taken years ago in front of the motel, back on the porch. Mr. Jian realized something was wrong. He didn't believe Ji-Ho would just let him go like that. Maybe he mistook him for a police officer. Moreover, he knew where he lived. He immediately realized that Ji-Ho had a bad intention and turned back just in time to stop him. Mr. Jian tried to calm Ji-Ho down. He called the nursing home and contacted Ji-Ho's father. On the phone, Mr. Gu thought his son was still 13 years old and promised him that after he finished dealing with the motel, he would pick him up and take him home. He hoped his son could learn to be strong the days without his parents. As he said these words, all that was in his mind were painful memories of the motel incident. He still remembered his son wanting a video game and promised him he would buy it for him and told him not to tell his mother. Knowing that his father had lost his memory but still remembered his hobbies, Ji-Ho cried. With a mix of emotions, he finally told Mr. Jian the whole story. That year, because of the murder at the motel, his parents' lives and memories were forever stuck in that motel where the murder happened. Years later, Ji-Ho heard that the murderer was going to publish a memoir, so he went to the ghostwriter's house and found out the writer was dead. Ji-Ho didn't call the police but stole the writer's manuscript. After reading it all, Ji-Ho felt very unfair. Even the murderer was planning to publish his memoir and come out of his sinful past. But his family was forever trapped by the past, trapped by that motel. So Ji-Ho decided to kill the murderer, not out of revenge, but because only then could he escape the past completely, not be trapped in pain like his parents. After listening to Ji-Ho's story, Mr. Jian burned all of the murderer's memoir and told Ji-Ho to take a bath. After Ji-ho finished showering, he thought Mr. Jian would advise him to confess, but Mr. Jian came up with an alibi for him, that he and Ji-ho had been drinking beer all night because he wanted to buy his motel, and then woke up the next morning. He hoped that the boy could have a good life in the future. Mr. Jian believed that death was not the answer, only living could escape suffering. After talking with Ji-ho, Mr. Jian called his friends and daughter, but no one answered. Finally, Mr. Jian called the woman. On the other end of the line, the woman, with a crazy look on her face and covered in blood, asked Mr. Jian when he was coming back to the cottage. Affected by the murder at the motel, Mr. Jian took his gun and bullets and went to the cottage. For him, hiding or confessing didn't matter anymore. The important thing was to face it and persevere. The reason why the crazy woman called Mr. Jian was because of what happened a few hours earlier. The woman went to her art exhibition, but she found out that the paintings on display were by another artist, and her own had been taken down. This was the decision of the exhibition manager. According to the manager, the woman's paintings were basically unsuitable for display. The woman tried to suppress her anger. At that moment, a man opened the door to her car. The man was her ex-husband, who had just been released from prison. Her ex-husband sarcastically commented on the woman's art exhibition. The woman became even more crazed and said that while painting, she thought of his dead son. The child the woman was referring to was the boy who was suspected of being killed by her at the cottage a year ago. The boy was her ex-husband's son and was not related to her. According to the woman, the boy had never considered her to be his mother. To confirm whether her ex-husband married her just to find a stepmother for his son, she killed the boy. After saying this, the crazy woman ran to push the alarm button. Her ex-husband also took a fire extinguisher and smashed the security room window where the woman was hiding, causing her to faint. At this time, many people had come to watch. Seeing this, her ex-husband quickly ran away. When she woke up, the woman suddenly became crazy. First, she drove to the art exhibition, saw the paintings she cherished discarded, and drove her car into the exhibition, accusing her father of not taking her ex-husband away from her sight. But he calmly said he couldn't do that and asked her to leave. The woman then went to the laundry, took off her blood-stained shirt, and hung it there. When she returned to the cottage, she happened to meet Mr. Jian's friend who was looking for him. The friend brought food for Mr. Jian, but the woman considered it hers and devoured it all. She told Mr. Jian's friend that Mr. Jian had agreed to sell her the cottage. The friend didn't believe it, saying that Mr. Jian was stubborn and wouldn't sell the cottage. The woman realized that she had been tricked by Mr. Jian. Mr. Jian's friend tried to leave, but the crazy woman wouldn't let him go and demanded that he apologize to her. The friend refused, so she took a screwdriver from the cottage and stabbed him, injuring him. Smelling the blood, the crazy woman was very excited and started buying things wildly at the supermarket. She especially bought a large bottle of bleach. The police chief happened to see this as he was passing by. After buying her tools for the crime, the crazy woman used Mr. Jian's friend's phone to text his daughter, lying that Mr. Jian was injured at the cottage. Mr. Jian's daughter hurried back to the cottage. The crazy woman enthusiastically welcomed her and said she couldn't reach Mr. Jian. Mr. Jian's daughter saw this and called her father, but she couldn't reach him either. Enraged, the crazy woman lashed out with cruel words. Mr. Jian's daughter realized that the woman was not a good person and grabbed her arm, demanding that she tell the truth. The crazy woman then made up a story, saying that a year ago she had attacked her ex-husband's son and Mr. Jian had helped her clean up the scene. Mr. Jian's daughter laughed, thinking the woman was crazy. As soon as she finished speaking, Mr. Jian's daughter suddenly felt a headache. It turned out that the crazy woman had slipped something into her drink earlier. Realizing the danger, Mr. Jian's daughter ran away. The two women began a chase, hunting each other in the cottage. Mr. Jian's daughter had the advantage and knocked the woman down, intending to rescue her father's friend. The woman wouldn't give up and attacked. She took the opportunity to injure Mr. Jian's daughter and then successfully turned the tables. Finally, she locked Mr. Jian's daughter in a suitcase. The woman continued to contact Mr. Jian. Realizing his daughter was in the woman's hands, Mr. Jian quickly grabbed his gun and bullets and ran to the cottage. But to save his daughter, he could only follow the woman's instructions. The woman treated Mr. Jian like a garbage can to vent her anger, complaining about the unpleasant things she had encountered at the art exhibition. She said the cottage was her real art exhibition. Before she could finish speaking, Mr. Jian lost his patience and fired a shot. The bullet grazed the woman. The woman saw through Mr. Jian's thoughts, telling him to go downstairs and save his injured friend first. Following the woman's instructions, Mr. Jian rescued his injured friend and took him to the hospital. On his way back, Mr. Jian was angry and his eyes were fierce, driving towards the woman. The woman quickly swerved to avoid being hit. Realizing that Mr. Jian had completely gone crazy, the woman ran into the cottage. Mr. Jian chased after her. Seeing his fierce expression, the woman quickly took out her plane ticket, promising to help Mr. Jian find his daughter, and she would leave forever. In return, Mr. Jian and those who knew about her had to keep her secret, otherwise, she would make the people around Mr. Jian be buried with her. At that moment, the police chief called. After hesitating, Mr. Jian hung up. The woman also compromised and agreed to take Mr. Jian to find his daughter. In the darkness, the car drove to a place. The suitcase the woman was pushing was on the road nearby. Mr. Jian asked the woman to open the suitcase. The woman looked inside. The suitcase was empty. Realizing something was wrong, the woman turned and ran away. Unexpectedly, the chief had brought people to surround her. A few hours ago, the laundry owner had reported to the chief that the woman had hung her blood-stained shirt in his shop. Then, the other friend told the chief that he had been stabbed by the woman with a screwdriver. The chief remembered the screwdriver he had seen with the woman and Mr. Jian's unusual behavior recently, so he blocked Mr. Jian's car and talked to him. Mr. Jian confessed honestly, telling the story of how the crazy woman kidnapped his daughter. To capture the woman, the chief laid out a plan, telling Mr. Jian stalled for time at the cottage while she sent police officers to find his daughter. The phone call to Mr. Jian was actually a signal. If the chief didn't actively hang up after one ring, it meant they had found the person. Following the chief's instructions, Mr. Jian intentionally didn't answer the phone. Then, through the surveillance cameras along the road, the chief determined the direction Mr. Jian and the woman were going. Waiting for the woman to appear at the crime scene, she immediately ordered her arrest. After the woman was apprehended, Mr. Jian rushed to the hospital. His daughter was seriously injured and needed emergency surgery. Mr. Jian cried and blamed himself, saying that it was his weakness and helplessness that had hurt his daughter. The chief came to comfort him and mentioned the word, frog. It turned out that the young female police officer who had experienced the cottage case years ago was the current chief. In this life, many people would be like frogs, hit by a random stone and then fall into self-blame, but never fight back. But at the same time, the chief also comforted him, saying that as a frog, that was the only thing a normal person could do. The chief's words woke Mr. Jian up. At this moment, he remembered that the woman had said she was going to bury something in the cottage. Mr. Jian suspected that the woman might have killed someone at the cottage. After arresting the woman, the chief immediately interrogated her. The woman pretended she didn't know anything. Unfortunately, she underestimated the chief, someone who even demons were afraid of. The more difficult the case, the more excited the chief became. She even talked to herself, speculating about the location of the body. When she mentioned the word cornfield, the chief noticed a slight change in the woman's expression, so she went to ask her superiors for permission to search the cornfield. Her superiors refused, so the chief took out the items the woman had bought, from tape to bleach, all of which were tools for committing a crime. The chief even swore that if she didn't find the body, she would take off her police uniform. Only then did her superiors agree to a search. The chief led people to search the cornfield. At the same time, Mr. Jian's daughter was out of danger after the surgery. The bad news was that the woman's father was rich and influential. Through the lawyer, his daughter was released. Hearing that the woman had been released, Mr. Jian was furious and yelled at the chief on the phone. The chief promised Mr. Jian that she would definitely find the body the woman had buried. Jian remembered the woman's plane ticket booked for tomorrow. He couldn't wait for the chief's investigation results, so he decided to find the woman himself and get revenge. After searching, the chief found a body in the cornfield. It was Xian Tay, the police officer who had been flirting with the woman. The police officer's death was a terrible tragedy. Then, they received a call saying the woman had set fire to the laundromat, causing an explosion. She had burned the bed sheets and blankets from the cottage. After cleaning everything up, the woman said goodbye to the cottage and planned to leave the country. Her ex-husband arrived with a gun. The woman learned from him that her father had allowed him to come. Furious, she called her father, but he remained silent. He had found bloody images of the murders on her computer. To protect his reputation and assets, he could only choose to ignore his daughter's fate. At this point, the woman tried to make her ex-husband angry. She admitted that she had killed his son in the cottage. Upon hearing this, the ex-husband was about to pull the trigger. Jian ran towards him. He apologized, saying he wasn't the one who hurt the boy, but he knew about it and hid it, so he was partly responsible. The ex-husband was furious and turned his gun on Jian, shooting him in the arm. He then moved towards the woman. Just then, the chief arrived and fired a shot at the ex-husband. The ex-husband was wounded, but he still pointed his gun at the woman. Jian stepped forward, pleading with the chief not to shoot and trying to calm the ex-husband down. The chief promised she would find the woman and bring her to justice, but the ex-husband didn't trust her. While they were arguing, the woman, in a fit of madness, grabbed the ex-husband's gun and attacked the chief before running away. The ex-husband chased after her and shot her dead by the pool. The woman finally ended up at the bottom of the pool. To make everything go smoothly, the woman's father hired a lawyer to defend the ex-husband, who had killed his own daughter. The good news was that Jian's daughter woke up safely. The injured friend also recovered and was released from the hospital. One snowy day, he visited Jian's cottage, remembering their past. After his wounds healed, Jian returned from Seoul, where his daughter lived. to the town and planned to fix up the damaged cottage with his friends. The chief visited Ji-ho, mentioning the murder at the motel years ago. She had known for a long time that Ji-ho was the motel owner's son and knew what he had done, but she didn't want to expose the truth. Ji-ho asked why. The chief said, "I don't want to hunt frogs anymore." To her, Jian and Ji-ho were ordinary people who had faced misfortune, but were still brave enough to confront it. She didn't want any more people like them to suffer. Sometime after that, the friend who owned the laundromat rebuilt his business and opened the cafe he had always dreamed of. Jian's cottage was also repaired, but it was no longer used for business. It became a place for his family to gather. His daughter gave birth to a child, and the family forgot their sorrow, living happily in the quiet wooden house in the woods. One day, Jian received a call from Ji-ho. Ji-ho wanted to visit Jian, the man who had encouraged him to live a good life. Jian welcomed Ji-ho's visit. One peaceful afternoon, Jian found a toy dog under the table. It was the toy belonging to the boy who had been killed by the crazed woman. Jian played with the dog, then looked around, hoping the frogs that had been thrown with stones would no longer remain silent. The movie ends here. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more great movies. Goodbye and see you again.